Hello friends, welcome back to another video and welcome to the channel where for the entire month of June we'll be focusing on queer authors for Pride Month. And in today's video we are going to be focusing on Love That Story by Jonathan Van Ness. JVN is non-binary, although from what I could see he does use he/him pronouns. Okay, so Wikipedia says that he has a preference for he/him but also has used the other pronouns interchangeably. This book is a collection of essays from the Emmy-nominated host of Queer Eye, thought-provoking essays on grief, healing, cannabis, LGBTQIA+ rights, imposter syndrome, personal style, HIV, and more. So we've got a wide range of topics, but ultimately it's just a book about queer experiences. The author is one of 5 hosts of Queer Eye, which is a show, I believe it's on Netflix. Originally the show came out in 2003, but there was a 2018 reboot that he is in. And it's an American reality television show about just improving people's lives. So you've got these 5 hosts and each of them specialize in a different thing. So one person focuses on hair or fashion, somebody else is focused on design, interior designing, somebody else is focused on food. You've got each of these 5 judges and they focus on different parts of a person's life and they just teach them how to live better. And the show has been very widely praised for being so inclusive. It's got queer main people, there's a lot of people of color, it's just good at showing all different types of people. I've never watched the show before, I would like to at some point, but I thought this was really fitting and I bought this book because I wanted to dye my hair. As you can see, it is now rainbow, but at the time of thinking of this, it was not. And I thought it would be really fun to do a reading vlog that was also a hair dye video, and then I saw that he had written a book, and then after purchasing the book and after kind of looking into it a little bit, I realized that he's the hair guy for the show. So it couldn't be more perfect. Originally, I got the idea because I thought hair dye and Queer Eye sounded cool for the title, but it ended up working out perfectly. But outside of Queer Eye, Jonathan is very successful just on his own as a person. He has a best-selling memoir that came out a couple years prior to this book. He sold out in Radio City for a comedy special. He's won an Emmy. This is his about page on his website. It just goes on. He does so much. It's so impressive to see somebody do that many things and such a wide range of things. I guess this is going to be a spoilers vlog. I'm kind of going to do this similarly to how I did All Boys Aren't Blue. I don't know what I would have to say about judging the way that it's presented because obviously it's his story. He's going to present it in whichever way is most fitting for him and his life. So instead of talking about my personal opinions, I'm just going to give you kind of a summary of what each of the chapters are. And then also interspersed with that, there's going to be hair dye clips from me doing this or me doing my friend's hair or whatever else. I read the first little introduction just to see what we're getting into with this, and I'm very excited. Again, with the All Boys Aren't Blue video, I talked about how that author has such a strong voice and they're not afraid to voice their opinion and to call out the things that need to be called out. They're not afraid to be aggressive with it or to be really outward with their opinions. And I think the same is going to be true of this book, where the writing is sarcastic and funny, but it's also really honest. I think it's a really good representation of who the author is. Even though I've never seen the show, I can imagine exactly the type of personality that he has. And I love when authors are able to portray their personality so well within the pages of a book. But the introduction is basically a recap of what happened between putting out his memoir and then putting out this book. And it talks about his fear of putting out that book, because before the book went out, an interview went out that was talking about the book and he was fearing that it wouldn't represent his story in the way that he wanted to tell it. And it also goes into how by writing that book, he now has to relive all the traumas that are written in it. Every time he talks about the book, anytime he thinks about the book, people are going into the most intimate moments of his life and they're going to be questioning everything about that because it's something that he put out into the world. And that's a really hard thing to do, and that's a really hard thing to live with and to constantly be bringing up. But it's also so important that people share their stories like that because that's how other people are going to feel more understood. I've decided to write this book of essays to share some of what I've observed through the years and because I'm curious about the different ways I can continue to grow and be a better person. If you're holding this book in your hands, I bet you feel the same. I love reading books from like-minded people who all just want to do better. I'm gonna cut back to some video from a couple days ago when we initially did hair, and then we will come back together and talk about the first couple chapters of this book.
With my hair, you don't begin it, you just look at my head and then it's bleached.
That makes sense. I have an idea. We just start the sides, yes. Then we'll worry about the rest later. I'm just talking to your hair.
Just like the grape soda and all of the other transformations that I've done over the years, it should be possible. It's almost shocking how close they are, and the only difference is this small extra part here.
Hello, welcome back. I've read chapters 1 and 2, so let's talk about them. Chapter 1 is called Processing Grief, and it's talking about a trauma that happened after his cat fell out of his window. It also talks about survival instinct while being a public figure. That's how this chapter starts, and he explains it by saying that what helped our ancestors not get eaten by predators is what has us up at 2 a.m. scrolling through toxic stuff a stranger has said about us to a bunch of other strangers. We're wired for it. It talks about how he very quickly went into the public eye, and with that came a lot of judgment and criticism. Which was really not helped by the fact that he had just put out his memoir in which he talks about being HIV positive, and he was fearing criticism from everything to do with that. But ultimately, it's something that people are just not ready for, all of the public judgment that comes from being online, because it's a bunch of strangers all over the internet and they can say whatever they want and there is no consequence. And it's just human nature to look for the worst comments, and it just makes you feel so terrible about yourself. And he just talks about how hard that was to manage, and how during one episode of the show, people were calling him out saying that he wasn't looking his usual self. He was looking a little bit out of it. And he tried to just work through it, and he tried to put out the show as usual, but the reason he was out of it is because his cat had just fallen out of his window and died. And he felt really, really bad about it, and it was something that really emotionally damaged him for a long time, because obviously you are responsible for this animal, and then to make a decision that leads to something as terrible as that, it's something that's gonna stick with you. But it was a big episode for the show that night, so he decided to just go into work as usual and to try and do his best to perform for everybody. And he says that he really loves the show, and he loves what he's able to do and the way that he's able to take his passions and make it a full career. But at the same time, he constantly has to keep up this persona. He's never able to deal with bad feelings, and through this trauma, he was able to realize how many other things he's pushed aside and compartmentalized. There are a lot of big, sad moments in his life that he's just tried to block out because it's too much to deal with. And in that moment, he wanted to take a sick day and he wanted to take time for himself, but he decided that the emotions weren't as important as the show. And you should never feel like that. You should always be able to prioritize yourself. And if you're working yourself so hard that you can't emotionally handle what you're doing, or you're working so hard to the point where if an emergency comes up, you're gonna prioritize the work, you need to reassess what you're doing, because your emotional health is very important. And if you try and push yourself too hard and you try to compartmentalize all these things, then you're not gonna be able to handle it, and eventually it's gonna bubble over, and you're gonna end up functioning so much worse than if you had just allowed yourself the time to grieve and allowed yourself the time to sort of manage anything that's going on. You have to be able to assess how you're feeling and if you are able to work at your fullest, or if you need to take time so that you can. He also talks about just taking the time to not go and bash people when you don't know anything about their lives, because you can say, oh, this person doesn't look their best, but you don't know what they're going through. And for him, making such a big show that was so widely talked about, he tried his best to put on a big act, but at the end of the day, the people who said that he wasn't looking great didn't know what he was dealing with. They just assumed that he should look better for the show, and that's not how we should treat celebrities. Like, regardless of how much of a public figure you are still a person, and you have to be considerate of that as a viewer. And he says that there's really no wrong way to process grief. You can manage it however you need to, as long as it's not harming other people. But you just have to have compassion for yourself is the main takeaway. And he rounds out the chapter by saying that to love is to suffer, because anytime you love something, you're acknowledging the risk that at some point you're gonna lose them. Because any person in your life that you love, if it's a relationship, maybe you break up, or maybe somebody dies, there's constantly gonna be tragedy. And it's the same thing with pets. Anytime that you decide to love something, you are accepting the risk that comes with of it. So you have to decide, are you gonna block yourself off emotionally? Are you gonna force yourself to not feel these big emotions? Or are you going to accept love into your life, but also understand that bad things could come from it? The second chapter is called The Continual Expression of My Personal Style. And it talks about how as a kid he was super into fashion, but that's something that the adults in his life were saying that's too feminine, you can't be into that, you can't explore that at all. And even in queer spaces, he was pushing aside this feminine version of himself because people weren't interested in that and he wanted to feel accepted. He felt that masculinity was the key to true love, so he tried to push aside his interests in order to be more appealing to other people. But by repressing those interests, he wasn't being true to himself, and eventually once he started showing more interest in fashion, his confidence grew and he was able to recover from addictions more because he was being more true to himself. He was able to hold himself to higher standards because he recognized his worth and he recognized his strength and he knew that he was able to conquer these bad things and that he deserved better. And eventually that led to him doing a career in exactly what the interest was, where now he's able to focus on personal style and he's able to afford expensive luxury fashion pieces that he was so interested in as a kid. But that brought a new issue, which was a little bit of a shopping addiction, where instead of investing in drugs, he would see an expensive piece and he would say, oh, that's really cool, but I don't need it, but it's on sale, but I really don't need it, but I could use this money for better things, but it looks really cool. And he would go back and forth, he would buy the super expensive piece, he would feel guilty for wasting his money, and the cycle continues. He wasn't using drugs anymore, but he was using now these big purchases to kind of fill the void in his life. And he talks about how magazines show that rich people are happy, that if you can afford these expensive things, you'll have a better life. And he wanted validation, and he found that through buying these expensive clothes and by presenting himself a certain way. He was trying to prove something because that's what he saw when he was a kid, as being like the top tier type of person. You know, you've made it when you can afford these things. And he mentions that he's still not over this, but he is aware of it, which is the first step to getting better. He talks about the damage that fashion can cause on our world, how it creates so much pollution, and how generally just the companies are bad, which is why thrifting is getting so popular now. He tries his best to research products before he buys them, and he tries to find, do these companies' morals align with my own? Is this something that I want to support? Are they ethically a good company? And I think that's so important because when you can afford luxury items, it's not about just, does this look cool? It's also, do I want to support this? Like, even as a casual consumer, no, you're not making the product, and no, by you stopping it, you're not gonna really change anything, but morally, do you feel okay supporting this company that is doing bad things? And can you find a company that is doing things in a better way, and would you rather support them? Which the answer should be yes, because we should care about our planet. But those are the first two chapters of this book. I think the next hair step, since I did dye it, I would like to shave the sides, because you can see I want my hair to be kind of curved like this. I don't like this extra strip that's on both sides, just this little extra curve. I want it to be more straight across so that I can tie it up without it looking weird and curving up like that. So the next step is going to be to shave the sides, and then I might re-dye the red just because this is after one wash and it is significantly lighter already. So that might be what's up next.
Welcome to Saturday Night Live. It's not Saturday. It is indeed night. This is not live.
It's 11:02.
Jesus and a capybara. This is Funyun. Don't drink coffee. It makes you illiterate.
I got some bad news. I'm gonna switch to time lapse because some people can't behave themselves.
I don't know what you're coming about. Mimi. So chunky. Mimi. Oh. Mimi.
everything I've wanted ever since I saw that one lady in Hunger Games. Do you know what I'm talking about?
I know what you're talking about. I don't know who.
The lady in Hunger Games.
The second Hunger Games?
She's got like a vine tattoo the whole way down her head. She's got it shaved just like this. And now it's me. Anyways, on to
July 1st, where the new law will be instated that at the age of 18, you will be able to buy a gun with no license and carry it around freely and legally in the state of Florida.
On to chapters 3 through 5. I finished the next 4 chapters of the book, chapters 3 through 6, so let's talk about them. Chapter 3 is talking about the queer history of his hometown that he as a kid felt so isolated in. And as an adult, he wanted to go back and see were there queer spaces available for him. And he discovered that there's a whole community that he didn't know about, and he wanted to focus on love and joy in his hometown instead. He wanted to reframe his idea of where he came from. And while I'm reading all these stories about queer spaces or drag performances or all these things where people feel so comforted and so understood, it makes me so upset that people are trying to take that away because it means so much to so many people. He specifically points out how queer spaces became so important when AIDS was making its rounds and affecting so many queer people because people were not really trying to help. And as a result of that, queer people had to focus on themselves and create their own support systems and their own health care, which is why thousands of people died, is because they weren't getting adequate care and they just kind of had to figure it out on their own. But he talks about the love that these communities had for each other and all the work that they put in to try and just survive. And he says that celebrating Pride isn't just about going out and doing all these big things. It's also just talking to your queer elders, talking about the people who came before you that were living in a world that was harder for them because they shaped what we have now, you know? And there's obviously still such a long way to go, but you have to respect what they did. He talks about how it's hard to report violence if you feel like you aren't going to be believed, because if you go to authorities and you say, hey, this person did this thing to me because of whatever minority, if you say because I am a person of color and they targeted me or because of whatever else, if you're not believed, it's going to make it that much harder, and it's also going to make it harder for you to even accept that it happened because the people that are supposed to protect you are going against you. And he also talks about how so many spaces were around bars because that's where you're allowed to be your true self. You're allowed to sort of separate from your regular life and you're allowed to focus on just existing. But also you have to remember that there are so many queer people that have issues with drug addiction or alcoholism. So yes, they are safe places and they are places of community, but also there's a lot of problems that come with those spaces. I'm very much repeating myself. I really don't like recording in public. I hope you get the idea. Chapter 4 talks about disordered eating and body image, and I really don't want to talk about that much. I don't feel comfortable reading it or talking about it in here, so I'm not going to go into detail, but just a fair warning if you happen to read this book that chapter does go into that. But it talks about how he overcame his body issues and how he's building confidence in the way that he looks and not living up to stereotypes or standards or anything like that. And he mentions that you get called brave for existing if you don't look like the ideal body type. If you have something that's different or something that isn't up to the standards that people have, then you're brave for showing it off. So for example, if you're overweight and you're not afraid to show it off, people say, oh, you're so brave for doing that, you inspired me, which the idea is cute, but at the end of the day, what it comes down to is, oh, I think you're less than ideal. When really all of our bodies are perfect. We all just exist in these bodies and that's it. He talks about how as a kid he went to food to cope, which you can see is a common trend throughout his life, is just going to unhealthy coping mechanisms, whether it be food or drugs or smoking or sex or shopping. And that's something that even now he's still dealing with. But he's trying to combat that by just focusing on body neutrality, not even necessarily positivity, because you're not always going to have a positive relationship, but just focusing on the idea that you have a body and that's it. It doesn't have to be good or bad, it's just a thing that is. And then chapter 6 focuses on his experiences with doing a little bit of the green drug. He talks about how the anti-drug programs have just leaned into fear-mongering and just tried to make it seem like they're so evil and that if you do one drug, you're gonna fall into this trap of doing all of them and it's gonna ruin your whole life. And instead of putting people off of it, it just showed them that it's something that's cool and rebellious, and it actually invited more people to do it just because you weren't allowed to know what happens. It's the same thing with sex education. If you don't tell people what's gonna happen, if you just say not to do it, they're gonna get curious and they're gonna find out, and all that means is that it's gonna be unhealthy and they're not gonna have support. The best thing that you can do is educate people on these things, even if you don't think they should do it, because if you tell them why they shouldn't do it, then they're less likely to. But if you just say it's a bad thing and leave it at that, nobody knows what that means. He talks about how he's had kind of a rough relationship with using. At some times he has been dependent, but currently he's using it to stabilize his life and to sort of balance out and manage his depression and to avoid his addiction with other drugs. And this chapter also goes into white privilege in the world of drug use and criminalization. Specifically, he shouts out a document called 13th by Ava. I cannot read that. My screen is so dark. I'll put it on the screen. But it talks about how the 13th Amendment, which is about slavery, has a loophole that allows slavery, so you're still able to keep white supremacy, but instead of being actual slaves, you just put them in prison. So you're still able to keep people of color in their place by just putting them in prison over minor crimes. And this has been happening for decades. People try to make drugs seem so much worse than they are, specifically if you are a person of color using them, and you're able to get in so much more trouble because of it. And how this country has just framed this narrative that makes it seem like such a terrible thing when in reality it's helping so many people, and we just haven't put in any research to figure out how it could be beneficial. He talks about how people use it as medicine, and instead of creating fear, we need to educate people. And then chapter 6 is going into his love for hairdressing and everything to do with hair. It taught him how to be self-sufficient, it taught him how to be successful and independent and responsible. In his early years when he was first starting out, he would do anything to get a client. He would just sit around and try and invite as many people in because he wanted the experience and he wanted to be able to do it as much as he could because he just loved it. But this also meant that he wasn't setting good boundaries for himself. He was just accepting any client that he could. Specifically, it goes into one story where a woman showed up. Her hair was completely botched and he spent hours working on it, but also all the dye materials he was paying for out of pocket, and she ended up not being able to pay for her appointment. So he spent hours of his time and all of his money on this hair, and he got nothing out of it except for that experience. And that did teach him how to set boundaries for himself, but also you have to be compassionate both as the hairdresser and as the client, because at the end of the day you're both just people and you're both coming in to do this thing together. And that's the key word, is it's happening together. A lot of hairdressers pay for their own materials and they don't get paid that great because a lot of them are independent contractors. So he says to just be considerate of their time and of their work, because they're not just services, they're also artists. And ultimately he just says to be kind. You know, when you go into a salon, you're going for somebody's work and you have to respect the work that they're gonna do. You can't sit and micromanage because you probably don't know as much as they do, and you can't take out your life on them. You have to treat them as a human being. And he wraps up the chapter by just saying some tips about how to be a good salon customer. Stuff like be calm when you come in and show pictures of what you want, whether it be the color or the cut, but also don't go in with unrealistic expectations. So if you have a picture of a haircut, you can't expect to have that exact haircut going out because your hair might be a different texture or it might be a different, like anything. There are so many variables that go into hair, so ultimately you have to just trust that your hairdresser will do good for you. And you have to be kind to them, and if you think that they didn't do a good job, communicate with them what you wanted or why they didn't provide it. You're both trying to figure out what works best for your hair. So you all just have to work together and be kind to each other and try and communicate and work it out. And if it doesn't work, then you can go to somebody else and it's really okay. You just gotta be kind. This is weird and I don't think I want to do this again, so I'll catch up with you guys at home.
Am I in the video?
Hello, I have successfully finished this book. Let's discuss. So, chapter 7 of this book is called Turf Wars, which if you don't know, that stands for Trans-Exclusionary Radical Feminist. The people that have so much potential, but they ruin it all with this one awful take. He starts off this chapter by writing about how when the new Harry Potter books were coming out, everybody would gather at these bookstores, regardless of who you were, you all came together to enjoy this one world. And it was such a special place for so many people, and then flash forward, and now the author is very much transphobic. And he explains their dislike to trans people because they argue that it's something new that media has promoted, and that by including trans women into women, you're actually taking away from the female experience, very much trying to stick to the gender binary. And the author argues that trans people have always existed. Our awareness of the binary is what's new. Our total obsession with keeping people in these boxes is not something that we've really needed to focus on, and now that people are becoming more vocal, you have people from this other side saying that it has to stay the way it's always been, but it never always was that. People have always existed outside of the binary. And this goes beyond just America. In other countries and other cultures, there are spaces open for people who are not male or female. And they are widely accepted as just a thing that people are. And it's been going on for as long as people have existed, so this is in no way a new thing. I wrote that this book and All Boys Aren't Blue pair really well with Caste. This is another book that I've been on and off reading for the past couple of months, but I really enjoyed reading it alongside both of these other books, because both of these books are talking about queer experiences, but also touching on how being a person of color makes them so much harder. And the troubles that are talked about in these books, really you get in depth with them in Caste. And I'm somebody who I do not enjoy reading nonfiction because I just get bored. But nonfiction like this, where it's something that we should be so passionate about, I found that I really enjoy it. And it all builds off of each other really nicely. Vanessa also goes into the whole sports argument about should trans people be allowed in sports with the gender that they are. And the whole argument is that they don't have the right hormones. So if you're a trans woman, you're gonna have too much testosterone, and that's going to be an unfair advantage. But he points out that what if somebody's just born and they're really tall? You're not going to say that's an unfair advantage. You're going to say that's just a part of who they are. And also, all people have varying levels of hormones, so there's no defined thing that says you can or can't be on this team. This is a very new rule that people are just kind of making up as they go along. He talks about people transitioning when they're younger and maybe going on hormone blockers. So if they're questioning how they want to identify, they can go on hormone blockers until they're ready to either transition or continue with the puberty that they were already having. And he mentions how news outlets will bring up certain words to try and scare you into being on their side. For example, putting out a whole list of treatments and grouping hormones with genital mutilation, which are very much not the same thing. Very much not what people are asking for, not what we want for kids. But people can promote them as being in the same category, and then people are like, no, we can't be doing that, so they're against the whole thing. And he talks about how it's all just based around confirmation bias, where they want to believe this thing, so they're only going to look for evidence that supports that. If they think that this whole process is evil, they're gonna only look at the bad information, and they're gonna group together any bad thing that they can, even if it's not really relevant, and especially if it's not the full story. They completely discredit how many people are saved by hormone blockers because they don't have to go through a puberty that they don't feel comfortable with. But we don't want to talk about that, right? Chapter 8 is called Imposter Syndrome, and it's all about his comedy career. Because while he's working as a hairstylist, he really liked making people laugh, he liked to make people feel good, and also laughing with other people about his personal stories helped him heal. Experiences that were embarrassing or things that he just carried with him, he was able to bring them to other people, and they could all sort of laugh about it together and make it into a more positive experience. He was ready to jump headfirst into the unknown because it was something he was passionate about. Even though he didn't really know anything in the world of comedy, he wanted to be a part of it. And then once Queer Eye took off, that kind of boosted his popularity, and he was able to book a lot more shows and have a lot more people coming to see them. This led to him going on comedy tours, but while he was touring, he made sure that everybody else that was performing sets with him, he made sure that they were all BIPOC or female or queer or any or all of the above. He tried to make sure that everybody performing with him had a diverse experience because he wanted to lift up their voices as much as possible, which is the same thing he had mentioned earlier with supporting clothing brands, where he tries to look up the more thought out fashion brands, and you can see so much how deeply he cares about all of these things. He's really trying so hard to use this place that he's in to boost up other people who are lower than him, and I think that's so cool, and I think it's so great to see somebody doing stuff like this. But despite all of this success, he didn't really feel like a real comedian, because when he was first starting out, people were saying, you have to quit your job as a hairstylist. You can't be doing all these other things, you have to put 110% into just comedy for it to work out. So when it started to work out, he felt like he didn't really work hard enough to deserve it. He wrote that imposter syndrome flourishes when paranoia creeps in, and you just have to remember that when people are saying negative things about you or about the things that you're doing, or they're saying that it's never gonna happen, you have to remember that they're either projecting their own insecurities and their own disappointments, or they're just being mean. Either way, what they're saying has very little value. It says, if you can't experience the joy and fulfillment of your own accomplishments, it can start to feel like none of it matters, so why bother? And there are any number of reasons why imposter syndrome can manifest. Poor self-esteem from growing up in a dysfunctional family can do it. Any combination of traumas can leave folks with a lingering shame that they don't deserve what they have. Queer people, BIPOCs, and women often feel it because we've been taught our whole lives, whether subtly or overtly, that we are already less than others, that our lives don't hold the same value. He makes it clear that doubt is totally normal. It's totally okay to question things, but don't let that take away from your worth. And he ends off the chapter by saying, if I ever switch to autopilot, that's when the joy of creating art will die. So he's always staying on his toes, he's always looking for new opportunities, and he's trying his best to shift doubt to motivation. You can use doubt to motivate yourself, but you also have to remember that what you're doing is pretty good, and you're still deserving of any success that comes with the hard work. Chapter 9 is called Sorry Karen, and it's about white fragility and supremacy. And I really like the disclaimer that comes at the start of this chapter. I'm bungled. Okay, I had to say goodbye to guests. And now, a bedtime story. This is addressed to people of color. It says, I know you do not need to listen to another white person's epiphanies about race and justice, but let me reassure you that I will do my best to stay in my lane and share my experiences from a self-aware and hopefully beneficial perspective. White people, if you're squirming with discomfort already, I've been there too, but this conversation is one that we need to have. What? So right away, I love the self-aware way that this chapter is written. He talks about how his first serious boyfriend was black, and because of that, he got introduced to this whole other perspective that he had never even considered because he grew up in a completely white household, so he never had to think about people who were less privileged. He calls out the flawed education system and how we're really only taught one type of history. And as much as we hope for change in education and we hope for more inclusive information, some schools are entirely banning it. Some schools are banning discussions about the way that America was formed, which is so wild and so harmful to everybody who's not white, and even to people who are white, because now they grow up believing that everything that they're taught is true. There's just so much wrong with that. How can you teach history and then ban some of it? Like, history is supposed to be a collective, here is the experience. How can you cut out half of the experience? But in this chapter, you find out that his dad supported Trump, which I'm gonna put links in the description, both to some things that he references in the book and also to an interview where he talks more about this and talks about generally just the stuff that's in this book. But he's so well-spoken, and it feels really good to see how much all of this matters to him. So I'm gonna put the link to that in the description because I really enjoyed watching it. It almost made me cry. But he tried to convince his dad to be more accepting, or at the very least to not vote for Trump, because that is actively going against your son's life. And he had to start distancing himself from his family, who is just not understanding the struggle that he's going through and the struggle that he would go through if this person were to be in power. But he does mention that his dad did get a little bit more curious, a little bit more invested in the conversations. It's a start, so there's hope that he's gonna improve. He also shouts out an interview from his show Getting Curious, which is on Netflix, and it's where he just interviews other people to get different perspectives. And he was talking to Alicia Garza about the legacy of slavery and how it's still affecting us now, which I can't link in this because it's Netflix, but I really want to watch all of the episodes of that. He admits that as a white person, it's hard to come to terms with the fact that your ancestors or whoever did such terrible things. It's really hard to hold yourself accountable just as a group. It's hard to identify with those things. You can say, I'm not racist all you want, but you're still acting like it, so just do better. Just acknowledge what's happening and then change it. Don't just do all these behaviors and then avoid the label. That doesn't change anything. And he rounds it out by saying that your discomfort as a white person is not going to compare to the suffering of the people of color that are affected. It might not feel good to associate with these bad actions, but at the end of the day, that's the first step to leveling the playing field, and you can only do that by admitting all the things that happened that were wrong. Because if white people continue to just deny the history and everything that's happened, people of color are gonna keep suffering, and there's no hope. You can't pretend that nothing was wrong there. Chapter 10 talks about the HIV safety net and how we need to have better support for people who are positive. He talks about how everything for treatment was expensive and confusing and inaccessible, and being where he was able to get treatment fairly quickly. At that point, he had enough money to be able to travel across the country in order to find good treatment. But for most people, that is not a reality. For most people, you have other concerns. You have your mental health, you have house bills, you have children, you have have so many other things in your life that are going to be a priority, so people neglect their own personal health, and as a result, their health declines. Even the people that want to prioritize it, either they don't have enough money or they don't have a way to get the treatment. Whether that be because they don't have a computer or they can't travel, or because their state doesn't care enough to fund the programs that would help them. If you live in a red state, they're probably not going to have that much help for you. And that goes for everything. That's not just for HIV help. That is for anything to do with existing. Red states are not going to be as kind to you. Imagine living in one of those states. But he explains that the reason that big government things don't like safety nets, they don't like providing free support like this, is they want to push the poor to work. They want to punish them for being poor and incentivize them to work. If people have resources to make sure you stay alive, how can you just deny? I don't know. It's gross and bad, and people of color, specifically Black people, have it especially bad in healthcare systems. They are not taken seriously, and if they are in treatment, they're just the lowest priority. There's so much messed up with the healthcare system, but you have to do it because that's all you have. He explains that support systems don't exist because the government decided to care. They exist because sick people demanded to be heard. So either forcing the government to take action, or they would just make their own support systems. The people who are supposed to care about us don't care at all. And then the last chapter is called Finished for Now, and he talks about how he's constantly on this journey to become his truer self. He's being kind to his inner child, and he just wants to stay empathetic. Not only for himself, but also the people around him. He wants to be more understanding. He wants to hear different perspectives from other people. He writes that the world could have enough space for everybody to succeed if we all took care of ourselves enough to create space to celebrate each other. He emphasizes that you don't have to validate your actions or your identity to anybody. You just be true to yourself, and that's enough. And then wraps it up by saying he currently lives with a husband, 5 cats, and 2 dogs, and he's being his truest self. Creating a world where we can learn that complexity is sexy, and simply applying a categorizing judgment is most certainly not. To live is also to connect, to experience joy, love, wonder, and curiosity. He says that he's not always the beacon of light and positivity that he appears to be. He's also disappointed, angry, irritated, and still dealing with trauma that he's incurred throughout his life. In other words, I'm human. Life isn't about always feeling an unbridled positivity, but it is about nurturing the sad part while knowing that somewhere within your happiness does exist, and it's there to connect with when you need to. Just as understanding how my past experiences affect my present, the experiences of others, not only in their own lives but in the generations that preceded theirs, requires me to constantly connect my empathy, patience, and ultimately a human curiosity that wants to help others find their joy and happiness. Above all the messages I try to share, this one is the one I hope people will take most seriously. I don't have all the answers yet, but as I learn them, I'll be right back to share them with you. It's such a hopeful ending. You hear all these terrible stories and all these frustrating experiences and how much life sucks for so many people and how the world can be so cruel. But he ends it off by saying that despite all of this, he was still able to find some version of happiness. He's still able to be true to himself even in a world that is so against what he is. And I think it's so powerful and it's so special, and I love seeing people that are able to do that. Because the more people that are out in the world being true to themselves and just showing that it's okay to exist like that, the more people are gonna feel okay to do that. Reading books like this makes me so motivated to be more involved in not only queer spaces, but also spaces with people of color, because all of my friends are white. No hate to my friends, but it would be really great to have a more diverse cast of people around me. Like I said, I'm gonna have some links in the description for things that were either related to the story or an interview that kind of shows the same ideas. And other than that, I am highlighting queer authors for all of Pride Month, so if you would like to see any of those, you can stick around. You can subscribe to this channel or my main channel, riverbxnd, where I post music content, or my Instagram, TikTok, Spotify, Goodreads, Storygraph, which I will link in the description. If you made it this far, thank you so much for sticking with me, and I will see you tomorrow with another video.